Hi, everybody. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. And Patty, I think you're a little excited for today's episode.
I'm actually looking forward to it. Yes. Something I've always been fascinated in is our dreams and our
Okay.
subconscious. So we're going to probably visit the subject in many different realms throughout the years because there's so much to talk about. But I wanted to just like stick our feet in the water a little bit today. Um,
That's funny that you mentioned that because about a week ago I had a semi-prophetic dream.
really?
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't have to go into it. Obviously you've prepared. So,
Oh, no. I mean, I think that's fascinating. I actually wasn't going to do dreams until yesterday.
hmm,
I just suddenly felt compelled. So I started pulling up data and went from there. So maybe it was meant to be.
I guess so. I mean, at least circumstances would point that way anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, because I told you, as I told you before, I have a couple other podcasts that were already pre-prepped
hmm
and ready to go. And I chose to last night and today to work on this one because I felt really strongly that I wanted to do this one.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's funny how things work out like that, but yeah.
So I'm going to look forward to if you want to share it to having you share it later
Yeah,
because
it'll
it's
be quick. I mean, it's not something that's long, but I mean, it's yeah, kind of sad, but yeah. But anyway, please,
no. So I think that dreams are fascinating in so many ways. So from ancient times on, dreams have been considered prophetic in some responses. Sometimes, as a communication from God or from the ethos. And some people believe that dreams are our subconscious talking to us. Sigmund Freud believed that it was our subconscious, and Carl Jung, who was a contemporary of his, also talked about it. And interestingly enough, Jung was a person who was what they called a lucid dreamer. He had lots of
Mhm.
different dreams and visions throughout his lifetime. So he was fascinated about it in um, a more prosaic way because he lived through it. And his last dream, um, Carl Jung talked about having a dream a few days before his death, and he said that he saw a great round stone engraved with the words, "And this shall be a sign unto all of you of wholeness and oneness." He awoke from the dream and told his family that he was going to die very shortly, that his life's work was now complete, and God had told him so. And
Oh,
indeed, a few days later, he passed away.
mhm.
Um, he took it very seriously. And dreams have different meanings. So some people dream of their own death, some people dream of other people's deaths, some people get other kinds of communications. And I thought we'd just pop through a few different things, stories that are fascinating. We did talk a little bit a while ago about Abraham Lincoln and his prophetic dreams. He had several throughout his lifetime. The most prominent and poignant being the dream before he accepted the nomination to run for election the second time. And he had a dream in which, first dream he had was of himself seeing himself in a mirror, and he was going to shave, and he saw himself as he was, and then as a gray, ghostly figure. And he took that to mean that he was not going to make it through his second term in office. And he told his wife, and she took it that way. But then he had a dream one night after he was reelected, and he heard people crying somewhere in the depths of the White House. And he would write about this dream, and he would tell it to friends and family, including his bodyguard, whose name was Ward Lamon, who would later chronicle that the president had told him this. And so what Lincoln told Lamon was that he heard people weeping, and he recognized the sound of people mourning. So he walked through the White House to the East Room. And in the East Room, he saw two soldiers standing by a coffin. And he walked up to one of the soldiers and he said, "Who has died?" And the soldier said, "The president, sir." And he awoke and he knew he wasn't going to make it through that term. So he had a prophetic dream of his own death. And, you know, he took it very seriously. He passed this story on multiple times to multiple people. It's not hearsay or from one person at all. There were several people who at the time felt compelled to pen their encounter with the president in their own journals or in letters to family or friends. And so there are multiple documents to prove this dream. And he related it exactly the same every time. And I think that that's, you know, that's fascinating. So there's a lot of people who dream things that happen to them, and some of them are beyond horrific. There was, for those who recognize the name, Sharon Tate. She was a beautiful young actress in the late 60s, early 70s. She was married to a producer from Hollywood, and she was pregnant, and she came home early from a production. She had been with her husband shooting over in Europe because she wanted to be home to have her baby at home. And she came back to her home in Aiello Canyon in Southern California, where she would die at the hands of the Manson family, along with 3 dear friends of hers who had been there visiting that weekend. But Sharon Tate told a really strange story to a gentleman by the name of Dick Kleiner, who was a reporter, and she was being interviewed by him about her success. She had started a movie called Valley of the Dolls, and this is what kind of propelled her into stardom. And long before she married Roman Polanski, the producer, and all of that. And she had known Kleiner for a while, so she confided to him she had had a very strange dream. So one of the people that was at the house with her the night that she was murdered was a gentleman by the name of Jay Sebring. He was a hairstylist to the male stars of Hollywood, and he had been her fiance prior to her meeting Roman Polanski, and they had lived in the home where Hollywood agent Paul Byrne from the 1930s had lived. And she would stay over there quite frequently with Jay. On one occasion, Jay asked her if she would stay at the house while he was gone and just kind of babysit the house. He was going to be gone for an extended period. And she agreed to do so. It was something she had done many times. And on this night, she would have a nightmare in which she would wake up, she claimed, because she heard a man talking. And she saw a little man, she described him later, who looked just like Paul Byrne. She would eventually find photographs of Paul Byrne and immediately identify him. And she said the man made her feel funny, and he was kind of bumbling about the bedroom as if he was looking for something. And in her dream, this is what she saw. This would be the summer of like 1967. She's terrified by what she's seeing, and she startles herself awake. She gets out of the bedroom, runs down the hallway, starts down the stairs, and that's when she stops halfway down the steps. Whether she was in a dream state or not, one can only speculate. She said, and this is her quote, "I saw something or someone tied to the staircase, whoever it was, and I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. But I knew somehow that it was either Jay or me, and he or she had them cut open at the throat." She was terrified. She managed to get past this figure, down the stairs got to the liquor cabinet, tried to calm down. She went back to the stairs, looked, there was nothing there. But she was completely convinced after that dream and that vision that she and Jay was going to die like that. And of course, subsequently, she would be captured by the Manson family, and they would be tied together, and both of them would have their throats slit. So she actually saw the vision of that, and she started out with it started out with a dream, and she was completely convinced that something was going to happen. And even though she was married to Roman Polanski, when she came home, she was 9 months pregnant. They had stayed friends, her and Jay Sebring. So he had come over to spend the evening with her and some of her other friends. And of course, history tells us what happened that night. We won't have to go into it, but it's a really frightening thought that she actually saw the vision of what would happen to her and Jay 3 to 4 years before it actually occurred.
Very interesting. The first time I've heard that story. Yeah.
I actually ran across it. I have a book, and it's called Where Dead Men Walk. And in that book, I tell that story. I came across the actual interviews because he actually had published the whole interview with her, but he separated out that segment and then would later write an article about it. And he, on a television show, played the audio tape of her telling that story. So there's no doubt that she actually does tell that story. And so I wrote about that case there. And there's a lot of people who have dreams that foretell their fates. There's a woman in 1975, her name is Allison. She lived in Texas, and one night she awoke from this terrible nightmare. She saw her little girl, who was a 4-year-old at the time. Her name was Tessa, and she was on a train track. And in the dream, Allison is running to get her daughter off the train track while a train is coming. And she recognizes the train. It was called the XE train. It's for a train that was in her area where she lived. And she felt the train hit her and her daughter. And she startled awake, sitting in bed. She's sobbing, telling her husband, who woke up because she screamed, what she had seen. And it just, he told her what everybody always says. It's a nightmare, honey. It's just a nightmare. It's not true. Don't worry about it. Unfortunately for her, it turned out to be true. About 2 weeks later, she was taking a friend to the train station. Something fell on the tracks. The little girl saw it and, trying to be helpful, went to pick it up. Mom saw there was a train coming, took off running to try to get to her child, and they were both hit on the tracks. Her husband would later report the story to a paranormal researcher, David Ryback, and he would document the story. And he would talk to family members, because she shared this story. She was convinced there was something to it. She shared this story with multiple family members before whatever happened, the train accident actually happened. And it was the most vivid dream she said she had ever had.
That's also very interesting.
It is. And I think dreams can tell you lots of different things. We're going to talk about a few others, but I'm going to cover a couple more people. Anybody who recognizes I'm an old rock person, so Leonard Skinner, and they had a terrible plane accident in which a good part of the band was killed. One of the vocalists for the group was a person named JoJo Billingsley, and she was completely convinced that the plane one of the planes they were going to get on in the next few days was going to crash. She had a nightmare, and she described it to the band. She told them that she saw a crash, and this was like 2 nights before they actually got on that plane. She was the only band member who refused to get on that plane that day. She refused to get on. She kept saying, no, this is bad. This is it. This is the plane. And she freaked them all out a little bit, but they agreed to get on, and she wouldn't. She said she'd take a bus, she'd take a train, she'd do anything else, but she wasn't getting on that plane. So she survived. And it really was just because she recognized the plane from her dream. Another one was Flight 191, which is considered the deadliest plane crash in the history of America. It took the lives of 273 people. And what was interesting is there was a gentleman by the name of David Booth who began to have nightmares about this plane. He wasn't on the plane. He wasn't going to get on that plane, but he began to have nightmares. He was so convinced. He knew the flight number. He knew the names of some of the people. He called and tried to talk to the FAA. They thought he was he was a crank. He kept insisting. A couple more nights went by. He was so terrified by what he was seeing in his sleep. He would try to stay awake at night and eventually fall asleep, only to have the same series of dreams over again. And he called multiple times. In fact, some of the FAA and officials began to write down what he was telling them. And everything he said came to pass. He had been desperately trying to tell them not to let that flight take off when it was time. Don't do it. Don't let them. But he described in detail exactly what would happen on that plane and exactly how and where it would crash.
I'm surprised that didn't make him suspect number one.
Well, I think because it was so long ago, people just didn't think the same way. I mean, there are stories, there are stories like that. There's a wonderful story from the Los Angeles area of a female. It was a woman. She was a nurse, and there was a woman who had gone missing in the area, and it made all the local papers in Los Angeles that this young lady had just disappeared out of nowhere. And this nurse began to have nightmares, and she was driving down a certain road. She knew the name of the road. She got to this fork in the road, and she saw that she took a road she had never been on before. She goes down this road, and it veers off into finally a dirt road out towards the desert. And she saw the body of this dead woman. This was so rattling to her that she finally, after night dreaming about it for 2 or 3 nights, she goes to the police and she says, look, I keep having this dream over and over, and I'm not a crazy. I don't do this stuff. I'm a nurse, and I think I know where this person's at. And they're like, lady, go home. Do you know how many cranks we get? So she and her teenage daughter, she feels compelled. So she takes her teenage daughter who was with her that day. She drives out, follows the roads, and they find the body. So obviously back in the time frame, it was the late 70s. Cell phones didn't exist. So she turns around and goes back to where she can find a payphone, calls the police, and she's like, she's out there, exactly where I told you. Well, the officers come out to investigate. Indeed, the young lady was murdered, and her body was out there in the desert, right where this woman described. This does make her prime suspect, and it takes days and days before they clear her. But she found this young lady who was missing. And it was interesting because right after that happened, she began to have other dreams. It was almost like something opened a conduit for her. And in other dreams over the next several years, she would also see dead people in the dreams who would tell her or show her where they were at. And she ended up helping the police in several different cases throughout that time frame, because these dreams would appear. And after the first case, she made a believer out of the police in that case. So whenever something would happen, she would go to them and she'd say, look, I had another dream and this is what I dreamt. And they would contact the police in that area and say, look, we thought she was a quack. She's not a quack. Give it a shot. Just follow her directions and see where it leads. And she found several other people. So, I mean, that happens quite frequently where somebody makes that kind of a connect. In Bedford County, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from, there's a story that has never been forgotten yet. If you look it up on the internet, it's usually referred to as the lost children of the Alleghenies. So basically, the story is that there were these 2 little boys. This would have been the late 1800s, and they were Georgie and Joey Cox. They were 5 and 7 years old, respectively. And it was a kind of cool, rainy spring morning. The boys were in the house with their mom and dad having breakfast, and their dad, Sam, said he was going to go out squirrel hunting. Well, the boys were collecting squirrel tails, so they wanted to go with him. But it was cold and rainy, and he told them, they should probably stay inside. Well, after their dad had left to go hunting, they pestered their mom, and their mom said, well, you can go out and ask your dad again. But if he says no, come back in. Well, they don't come back in. So she thinks that he must have given in and let them tag along.
Right.
And lunchtime comes, he comes back, and he's like, where are the kids? And she's like, what do you mean, where are the kids? They were with you. He's like, they weren't with me. So what had happened is they had kind of snuck along behind him, staying out of sight. And so they immediately realize something's wrong. They go looking for the kids. When he realizes he's not finding them, he rides down to the little town of Pleasantville and tells people, the boys are lost. We need help. And within hours, there are people all over that mountain looking for those children. It is unusually cold and rainy, and it's flooded, and they make a really bad mistake. They make the mistake of thinking the kids can't cross the swollen creek. In the meantime, day after day, there's people coming. In fact, they said people came from 80 miles away over the course of that period of time after hearing about the kids being missing. And there was a gentleman in the area whose name is Jacob Divert. Jacob Divert was ill, and he felt really bad about the fact he couldn't go out and help look for those little boys. Everybody thought at first, when he started talking about the dreams, that he was just his guilt, for not being able to go out and help. So about 4 nights out, the kids are still missing, and he has this dream that he's walking along this trail in the woods. He comes to a tree over a swollen creek. He sees a dead deer as he's walking along after he crosses the log. He sees a little boy's shoe. He goes a little further, and then there's a V in the creek. And in the crotch of a tree that sits in that V, he sees the 2 little boys. And he's really startled, and he recognized the general area. In fact, it was part of his wife's family farm. He'd been there many times. So the next day, he tells her about it, and then that night he has a second dream, same dream, repeated. And the next morning, he's so convinced something's wrong, that he needs to do something. He convinces her that they have to go what was for them at that time probably 30 miles, mid 1800s. That's a long haul.
Right.
But they traveled the 30 miles to the Wysong farm. Her family's name was Wysong. He tells her brother, and he's like, oh, I think I know exactly where you're talking about, but that's too far out. They wouldn't be over there. But because Jacob Divert's so adamant, her brother says, okay, look, I'll just go walk the trail, prove to you there's nothing going on, and I'll be right back. So he walks down the trail. He comes to the tree across the creek, which he had not known was there. He walks across the tree. He sees the dead deer, the little boy's shoe, goes a little further out and sees where the creek V's, and there's a tree sitting there in that V area, and there's the 2 little boys sitting there dead. They had died of exposure. And the big mistake, the reason they weren't found alive, is because everybody assumed with the creek swollen like that, the children would never be able to cross the creek. But with the tree down, the children were able to cross the creek. And they made it across, and it's estimated that the children had probably died the night that he had the dream for the first time. That after they passed, that somehow they communicated their location to him so that their bodies could be found. There's a memorial up in the mountain there. It's in a state park, and people go there all the time. I used to walk up there with my kids, and they would always run up to the memorial and ask me to tell them the story of the 2 little Cox children. And, it's a very poignant story, and there's no doubt that Jacob Divert did have that dream. First of all, the police did look into seeing if he had anything to do with it, but he had been ill and in bed and under a doctor's care 30 some miles away, which doesn't sound that far to us today, but if you're doing it by horse and wagon, it's half a day's drive or more. And second of all, he told the story every single year. There's actually was a memorial picnic every year in memory of the children. And for most of his life, Jacob Dibert would return there every year on the anniversary of their death. And he would tell the story of how the boys led him to find them so that they could go home. So, their dream was what it was. And, people dreaming about other people's deaths or solving crimes because of a dream. There are literally hundreds of these stories, maybe thousands of them. I found another story during the Great Depression. There was a gentleman by the name of Martin Schwab. He was a Mormon gentleman from Utah. He took a job at the Champion Cash Register Company, and he would travel all over the Southwest selling cash registers. He was pretty good at the job, but it meant he had to be away from home a lot. So he would get in his car and he would, travel and sell cash registers to different businesses. And every night he would write home to his wife. People didn't use the phone like they do today. This was like 1920. And he would write a little letter to his wife and stick it in the mail. And he would tell her where he would be. Like, 5 days from now, I'll be in this town and I'm going to stay at this motel or hotel. So she would know where to address her letters to. So she could write back every so often. So it was March of 1920, and he took the job in April. It was April 13th. He checked into this little hotel in Flagstaff, Arizona. The next morning, he got up, he got in his car, and he was headed to a place called Walnut Canyon, Arizona, about 50 miles east of Flagstaff. He was going to stop in that town and try to sell a couple cash registers. He checked into the little hotel there on the 15th of April, and he wrote a letter to his wife, and that's the last communication anybody ever had with Martin. He's just gone. So his wife, she keeps waiting, and after she doesn't get a letter for about 13, 14 days, she contacts the company, and she's like, "Have you heard anything from my husband? I haven't heard anything, and that's not like him. He would send me a note every night." And they began to try to find him, and eventually they would send a man out to Arizona to the last known location, and he would ask around. And he found out that this gentleman had stayed in the hotel that night. He had got up in the morning, he had breakfast, got into the car. He had told people he was heading toward Winslow, Arizona, to visit that town. And the people at the hotel had said they saw him get in the car, they saw him go. But that was it. He and the car disappeared at that point. There was an older gentleman who was also a Mormon fella, and he began to have dreams. And eventually a letter would be sent to Flagstaff to Sheriff Jack Harrington. And the letter came from a fellow by the name of Roy Gardner. And Gardner said, "Hey, I'm writing on behalf of my friend. He's 78 years old, and he lives near Salt Lake City, and he's been having dreams, and his dreams always come true. He's dreaming about this guy, Schwab, Martin Schwab. He read about him in the newspaper a few weeks ago because, they were looking for him. And he said he had this dream, and he describes the dream, how Martin picked up these 3 men. He was in his car, and he offered them a ride. The car broke down on the top of a hill out in the middle of nowhere, and the men attacked him. They beat him and killed him and fixed the car. It was something small, and took off. He gave them, this older man gave them directions. He drew a map. He told them what towns that these people went to and what states they were in, all kinds of information. And then he drew a map to the body. And he said, you can see the San Francisco mountains about 30 miles in the distance. You need to go about 1,000 yards off this trail. And all of this information. He told them that the men had gone to Phoenix, Arizona. Then after they had sold the car, they went to Denver, Colorado. Then they went to Butte, Montana. And he described everything except he couldn't describe what they looked like, which sounds crazy. On September 18th, a second letter came to the police department, and in this one he drew another map, and he said he's buried in a place that's full of clay. There's sand. It's halfway between Flagstaff and Winslow. There's no woods. There's no rocks. You know, he gave every direction. So finally, the police chief drives this road, figuring, you know, take a shot. He sees the San Francisco mountains hoving up in the distance, and he slows down. And he starts following the map more closely in the written directions. And sure enough, he comes to a spot that fits the bill. No rocks, nothing but sand. There's this wide spot, the whole 9 yards. He's walking around here. He's looking for it. He's sure he's got the right place, but nothing. A couple days later, he gets a phone call from the police in that area. And they say that there was these little boys out in the desert. You know, they lived in that area. And they were messing around in a little gully. They found a cash register, all kind of weathered, on the ground. And when they lifted the cash register up, the decomposing face of a man was underneath it. And the paperwork in the man's pocket indicated he was the man who was missing. When he drove to the spot, he was literally less than 2,000 yards away from the right spot when he turned around and went back. But it is exactly where this man dreamt he would be. Eventually, they would catch the killers, all three of them. And they would find that they went to every place he named in his letters. So, you know, his letters were very instrumental in helping them to find the killer and to bringing the family some peace. So it's a fascinating story. And when you look at the fact that they drew a map and he gave so much direction and so much of it was real, you have to wonder, you know, how did that happen? Is that an accident? Is it really somebody reaching out from beyond to help find their own body so that they can, or solve their own murder or whatever it is? There are so many stories of that.
That's what was going through my head. I'm saying, was the murdered man the one who provided this information? But why pick somebody in Utah, in Salt Lake City? You know,
right? I don't know, and it's interesting
Mm-hmm.
for that reason. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories. There's a story from Chicago of a young woman from, I think she was Vietnamese. Her name was Tara Bassa. She worked at a hospital out there. She had made friends with two of the doctors of a married couple who were also from the same region she had been born in, and they had come to the United States as well. And she had been murdered in her home, Tara Bassa. And the female doctor, who was one of her girlfriends, was in the hospital one day. She was trying to rest. She had been on, you know, the doctors have these long shifts, and she was exhausted. She had laid down in the doctor's area, and she was trying to sleep, and she dreamt that Tara Bassa was talking to her and telling her who murdered her, and showed her a green jade bracelet that her mother had made for her before she left home. And this information was just overwhelming. The woman woke up, she found her husband, she told him everything, and he's like, it's a dream, we're not getting involved. She would come to this woman and give her another dream and talk to her in this dream and beg her for help me to solve this, help me to get justice. So eventually the female doctor persuaded her husband that they had to go to the police with this information. You know, coming from the culture they came from and the political climate in their home country, it probably took a lot of convincing, because you didn't rock the boat, and you certainly didn't run around making accusations about people, you know. And that's what they had come here to get away from, that world, and they didn't want to draw any attention. But they did finally go. And they named the person that they knew the person, and they named the person that she said. and they told them about a jade bracelet. The police interviewed the guy. He was suspicious. He admitted he had been in this woman's apartment to fix her TV. He had actually been a handyman at the hospital, but he was adamant he was working that day. They checked into it. He was not working that day. Lie number one. So once you start lying to the police, they get really suspicious. Eventually, they contacted his girlfriend, and they asked her if he'd given her any jewelry. And she said, "Oh yeah, I have several things he's given me." And she brought them in, and she gave them this baggie full of jewelry. And at the time, she was wearing a green jade bracelet. And they said, "Where did that come from?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, he gave me this too." And it was very unique because it was handmade just for her. And they had a photograph of her wearing it. And they compared them, and it was the exact same. And it was with that information that they finally got this man to confess. But Tara Bossa solved her own murder in a dream.
Almost like a Hollywood movie plot.
It is, isn't it? I mean, you can go back 100, 200, 300 years. You can find stories of people who have reached out from the dead, or people who have dreamt they were going to pass away, or that something was about to happen. And, it comes back to where we started with, is it collective consciousness? Is it the person really does reach out from the dead, or family members reach out and give you the information if you're going to die? I was doing some reading, and I'll end it with this. As you know, I used to do like some hospice work and stuff, and I had several experiences that were really interesting from clients during that time frame in my life. And I changed my opinion about death greatly during that period of time. And when I was a child growing up, I lost my baby brother, my dad, my uncle, and my grandmother in 17 days when I was 12. So I always thought of death as my enemy. And after doing the hospice, I no longer had that feeling. I began to realize that death sometimes is not the enemy. Sometimes it's sweet relief, and it's kind, and it's gentle. And then I had another event where I encountered what I believe to have been death. And I've talked about it a couple times with you, I know. And I found that this entity was extremely loving and gracious. And I was just amazed. I just wept openly with the amount of love that he gave off of him. But anyhow, I just was really changed my whole universe on the subject. And anyhow, this researcher that I was reading, he was a doctor working for hospice. And he talked about the fact that he came into it seeing death as the enemy. And I got it immediately. As a doctor, you're fighting to keep people alive. So that's your enemy. Just like I was angry because death took my family members, and I saw him as my enemy. And he talked about people who had dreams of family members coming to visit them, or hallucinations of it, within days before they were to die. And he said, he made this really cool statement about how science is not equipped to deal with it. Medicine is not equipped to deal with this. That both focus solely on the physical survival of the human being. Nobody's focusing on the soul survival, SOUL, of the person. He changed his whole attitude because he had so many patients over the course of his time who came to him and said, "I can't tell my children because they'll think I'm crazy, but I saw my mother last night. She said I'm going to die now, like tonight. So I just wanted to tell you, doctor, thank you for everything. And I hope you don't think I'm crazy too." And he's like, invariably, this happened, and it began putting him on a road. He actually wrote a wonderful book on the subject about people seeing in their dreams, or just as they're awakening, family members who were there to comfort them. And he talked about how this became it made the grieving process or the acceptance of death more palatable for the family when they had these experiences. So I find in all seriousness, I find this subject fascinating because something is reaching out to us from beyond. It reaches out in our dreams. Sometimes it's just a dream and it's just our subconscious, yes. But every so often, things happen that you can't explain, like dreaming about somebody who's dead that you never met, or seeing somebody that you haven't seen in 60 years and saying, I talked to my grandmother last night. You're now 70 yourself, and your family's like, Mama, you didn't talk to your grandmother. And, at that point, they usually shut down, and the doctor's saying, you need to let them talk, because he's come to believe that they did talk to their grandmother. They are in that process, and that this dream state is a state where we can communicate in ways we don't allow ourselves to when we're awake.
Yeah, I don't think you'd collect more than one or two stories before you, or heard one or two stories from people like that before you put some credence to it.
Yes, and like I said, I had over the years, multiple events, and most of the time it wasn't even something that, like sometimes they weren't telling me they had Alzheimer's or something, but they would be talking in their sleep to somebody, and I would say to the family members later, she was restless today. She was talking to, I don't know who this was, but it was Edith. And they would go, Edith? And I'm like, yes, she kept saying something about, milking the cows. And she's like, oh my God, that was her sister. And that was their job when they were teenagers. And Edith died like when she was like 30. And you would start to piece those things together, and you're like, really? And she would be like, oh, Edith, are you here to come and get me? And you'd be hearing her in her dream, talking. And sometimes I would wake them up in the beginning, and then I got to the place where I just left them have their dreams, because I realized I was interrupting something very intimate, and I stopped doing that.
Mm-hmm.
You had started out the whole episode saying you had something that you had recently happened to you.
Yeah.
Please.
Now this will be anticlimactic after listening to all of your stories. But okay, so Mrs. Stu and I have adopted several pets from a local no-kill shelter. And so the last one we got was Cassie, who's appeared in these videos sometimes. And we've had her now a year. And probably 2 years before that, we got Molly. Now, Molly's a little black cat who mostly keeps to herself. And in fact, when Cassie came into the house, Molly does not like other cats. Molly likes to be by herself. We had to go to the shores of Lake Champlain for a nephew's wedding. And while we were there, we were looking at the Facebook page of this particular no-kill shelter, and they had this gorgeous cat that just spoke to both of us. And we said, well, if he's still there when we come back, we'll think about it. Anyway, so in this dream, we got this cat, and we brought him home. And Cassie warmed up to him, or he was able to work with Cassie. Molly just in the dream, Molly just completely would hide. She wouldn't eat or anything like that, and she died because she was isolating. She was just so afraid and isolated herself. And so I told Mrs. Stu about this, and I said, we should not get that cat, because something will happen to Molly if we get the cat. So, and it, for the most part, Cassie's quote my cat, and Molly is her cat. So this dream was, without getting too much into the detail, other than that, I mean, there were things that happened in this dream that made me think that this was going to happen if we adopted that cat. So we did not adopt the cat. And he's still there, and I mean, I'm still trying to second guess myself, but
right.
Yeah, but we didn't get this other little cat, and I'm hoping he finds a home.
Hopefully he will.
Well,
but I'm glad you're heeding the dream, because I agree with you. There's a good chance it's a warning.
Yeah. So, and the only other thing I was thinking about whenever you were mentioning Winslow, Arizona, the last time I heard about that was in an Eagles song.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. So, But unless you have more stories, I mean, we can
Nope,
say,
that's all my stories for tonight.
okay, well, we can say thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. And we would very much appreciate it if you were to click the like button or give us a great rating on your podcast platform. And if you have ideas, send them to our email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. You can also look at our Facebook page. We'd be very happy to have you join our Facebook page and subscribe to this YouTube channel if you would, if that's your thing too. We'd be very happy to have you on board there too. So with that, I think I have exhausted everything I had to say.
Yep. So I'm going to wish you and everyone a good evening.
Thanks, Patty. Good night.
Good night.